Welcome to the Youth Justice Action webinar series hosted by the Office of Youth and Community Restoration, also known as OYCR. My name is Victoria, and I am a member of the OYCR Youth Advisory Board. Before we get started, we have a couple of quick announcements to share. Today's webinar will be recorded and posted on the OYCR Training Resources page. The slides that are used for today's presentation will be shared in a follow-up email, and please be sure to keep your microphone muted during today's presentation. We welcome you to share your questions throughout in the chat throughout today's presentation. We'll keep track of your questions and we'll answer as many of your questions as possible at the end of the presentation. Today's session has been approved for 1 hour of STC credit and continuing education credit with the Board of Behavioral Sciences. To receive credit for attending, you must stay for the duration of the webinar. I would like to welcome Director Kathleen Lucero, Director of OYCR, who will share more about today's webinar.
Thank you, Victoria. In today's webinar, you will learn about a soon-to-be published report titled Fewer Chutes, More Ladders, Preventing Juvenile Legal Involvement and Ensuring Successful School Reentry for California's Youth. The report outlines evidence-based strategies to disrupt school-to-justice pathways and to ensure successful school reentry for youth. Keeping children and youth in school is the #1 strategy to keep them from entering into the juvenile justice system. This work is especially timely in California, where SB 823 has placed a greater responsibility on counties to support justice-involved youth, where statewide education initiatives are prioritizing student attendance, engagement, and well-being. Strengthening school pathways is central to both efforts. We anticipate this report will be published on the OYCR website soon. In the meantime, today's webinar will provide you with an early preview of findings and takeaways from the report. To develop this report, OYCR partnered with Forward Change, a justice-centered strategy organization that helps partners design and implement equity-driven policies and programs. As you may recall, the Child Welfare Council's Youth Justice Committee, which I am one of 3 co-chairs, selected this topic as one of its priorities in 2022. This is actually the second report authored by Forward Change in what we're calling a really important treatise, if you will, on first, it was higher education focus, and this is how to keep kids in school and never getting to the front door of juvenile hall in the first place. Today, we are joined by the president and CEO of Forward Change, Arnold Chandler. In his role at Forward Change, Arnold leads work to advance racial, gender, and economic justice through holistic, research-driven strategies. At Forward Change, Arnold guides social change partners in developing and implementing holistic, evidence-based informed strategies grounded in rigorous research, substantive expertise, and a power building perspective. For more than 22 years, Arnold has been an advocate, researcher, and social change strategist, helping government agencies, nonprofits, and foundations strengthen policies and programs that promote equity. Arnold also draws on years of research and policy strategy work in leading equity organizations, including significant contributions to law enforcement reform initiatives. I am pleased to introduce Arnold Chandler, who will lead today's webinar presentation. Arnold?
Thank you, Director Lucero. Let me get my shared screen up for you all. I'm very delighted to be here. And I'm going to be presenting for approximately the next 45 minutes or so, or 40 minutes. I'll try and adjust it, especially if there's a lot of questions coming in. I want to make sure that I have a chance to answer everybody's questions. And as was mentioned, the slides you're about to see will be shared with you afterwards. So if anybody's worried that you're going to have to be snapping photos or something's going to drift into the ether, never to return, don't worry. It will be in your inbox soon. There are a number of areas where I cite things on the slide. I include citations. So for those who like to follow those those crumb trails to more information, they will be available to you in a bigger font later on to peruse at your leisure. As Director Lucero mentioned, the name of this presentation is Fewer Chutes, More Ladders, the name also of the report, and it's focused on preventing juvenile legal involvement and ensuring successful school reentry for California's youth. It focuses on two things. One, preventing the entry into the front door, so to speak, of the juvenile legal system. And we're going to talk about the predictors of those pathways, what the evidence suggests are the predictors / causal factors that drive a young person to become entangled in the juvenile legal system. And then we're going to look at interventions that can prevent those pathways from being traversed by young people. Then we're going to pivot and we're going to talk about what the predictors and the interventions are at a high level for ensuring that youth return from involvement in the juvenile legal system, in particular to being enrolled and sustaining their participation in school all the way to high school graduation. We're going to look at the evidence on that. Everything that we profile as far as interventions is drawn from randomized controlled trial evaluated interventions, so the most rigorous evidence that we have out there. And in the report, each of the things that I'll show you in just a moment are described in a fair bit of detail. So one limitation, I think, of some reports is that we might list a bunch of interventions, evidence-based practices, but not give you any meat on what those entail. We do that substantially in the report. I will do a couple dives in a couple places on some key interventions so you have a sense of what they mean. So let me start scrolling along. Okay, so the overview of the presentation starts with the basic fact that there are too many youth who end up in the school to prison pipeline. And it's essential that we reroute those students largely because they are valuable resources to our state. And when put on pathways of opportunity, they tend to thrive. And we've had the pleasure, my colleague Mary and I, in doing this report, of talking to dozens of formerly incarcerated juveniles who are now, in many cases, in adulthood, some of their 20s, 30s, even late 30s, who are lawyers and professionals and doing all kinds of incredible work. And they talk about how essential it was for someone actually to give them a hand to reroute their trajectories towards their successful pathways that they're on. And now they are contributing enormously to our society. And so that is a underlying value premise of this overall work, is that these young people are assets, not liabilities. And we need to create the opportunity for them to turn that potential into reality. We need to divert these young people away from towards opportunity pathways and away from punishment pathways. Currently, many youth in California, we'll see some of the data that speaks to that, are on these punishment pathways that starts in school, that starts fairly early, and will eventually get the scarlet letter of some type of incarceration as a juvenile, and then into adulthood, being incarcerated as an adult, particularly with a felony conviction, that in many ways locks them up out of opportunity in adulthood for life. We're trying to prevent that eventual reality by intervening at the stage in which the evidence is fairly clear that we can have the greatest impact. And that's when young people are young, before they become adults. Intervening at that stage yields tremendous dividends later on in adulthood. Youth involved in the juvenile legal system, as I mentioned, have tremendous potential. What we're going to talk about is reducing their pathways into system involvement. And the metaphor that we've used in the report is called chutes and ladders. This is an old game from the early 20th century that it's a board game in which you move space to space, kind of like Candyland, or some of the people may not even know what Candyland is, but some of the games we used to play as kids, if you're Generation X and older, Chutes and Ladders was one of those games. And as you moved along, if you hit a chute, which is like almost like a trap door, but it's a chute, you drop and you go back a bunch of spaces and you have to start over again. A ladder, though, helps you get back on a positive trajectory in that board game if you've fallen off track. It allows you to move forward in a progressive way. And so that's what this report is really about, getting rid of those chutes that are putting kids off track and building more ladders that if you do get off track, you can get back on track. And I think the evidence in terms of longitudinal studies is fairly clear that without intervention, young people don't get back on track. They stay off track. And part of the reason they stay on track is because systems lock them out. And their response to that system lockout reinforces that negative trajectory. And we talk a great deal in the report about some systems reforms. I will just give a high level reference to those. And I'll tell you kind of a thumbnail of what they cover, but there are important systems reforms that we think are the crucial ingredients to building the ladders to success for these young people once they've gotten involved in the juvenile legal system. The methodology for this report relied on a fairly substantial synthesis of research literature. We identified and coded more than 426 research articles on interventions and predictors, essentially. And we conducted a lot of interviews with folks across the state, a diverse set of stakeholders, a lot of formerly incarcerated juveniles who are mostly now adults. We talked to everybody who you can think of involved in the juvenile legal system, from probation chiefs down to folks who run education inside juvenile justice facilities, to teachers in those facilities, to folks who are principals, school board members, people who are school superintendents, et cetera. Just a broad cross-section of people to get a properly developed perspective on the issues that arise for this population and the potential pathways to intervene. The first section of the report is about eliminating chutes, eliminating those trap doors that youth fall through that gets them off track and without intervention can leave them off track permanently. And we're focusing on, in this case, California. A lot of the interviews that we did were to make this stuff that we might find in the research literature directly applicable to the story playing out in California. And so we don't want to just present an article that doesn't have specific applicability to the context of California. We wanted to take the evidence base and then adapt it and massage it so that it's appropriate for the story that takes place in this state. The school to incarceration pathways, we looked at the predictors of involvement in the juvenile legal system, and they fell into a few different categories. The first category are life course outcome predictors. These are the things that we usually have good data on that measures a kid's movement from one milestone to another, positive or negative milestones that predict whether or not they'll become involved in the juvenile legal system and also their pathways out of that system. The markers that tell us that kids are on track to returning successfully from juvenile legal involvement. There are also developmental predictors. Unfortunately, we don't track this stuff very well. These are there are some instances in which we become aware of these things, like a substance abuse issue as a developmental factor. But generally speaking, or addiction, I should say, that gives rise to the substance abuse issue. But generally, we don't have good data tracking of developmental predictors, but we know there are several. And we know when assessments are done when youth enter juvenile justice facilities of these underlying developmental predictors, the population that ends up incarcerated or ends up involved in the juvenile legal system will exhibit many of these developmental factors that we're going to identify here. But unfortunately, we don't have as good data as we might to tell us what is happening with these youth that puts them at risk. And then the last thing are the environmental predictors. These are the environments that young people are embedded in that make it more likely they'll become involved in the juvenile legal system. Family risk factors, school factors, and place-based factors. We're really going to focus in first on the life course predictors because, again, we have data that tracks these for a lot of kids administratively more so than we have the other types of data. One of the early predictors in elementary school of becoming involved in the juvenile legal system are patterns of consistent behavioral problems, particularly externalizing behavior, acting out, aggression, etc. Special education identification, having a learning disability is also an important predictor of involvement in the juvenile legal system. And we don't know which one, whether or not they can be disentangled, meaning we don't know if it's the underlying learning disability or if it's being identified as having a disability that are predictors of involvement in the juvenile legal system. That is currently a puzzle that hasn't been unraveled in research literature. Grade repetition, repeating a grade, especially after the sixth grade. Repeating a grade before the sixth grade, in the evidence I've seen broadly, is less negatively predictive of long-term outcomes. However, repeating a grade after the sixth grade, meaning after you entered middle school, is strongly negatively predictive of juvenile delinquency and dropping out of school. And so we put it right there at the beginning of the preteen years. Unstructured socializing, spending a lot of time with other youth without the presence of adults and adult supervision. Verbal reading aptitude scores. Truancy, absenteeism, being absent from school. Truancy being far more potent predictor than just absenteeism for long-term outcomes. Skipping classes, skipping school. Poor grades. deviant peer associations, hanging out with kids who are engaged in delinquency or with substance abuse issues, suspensions and expulsions, delinquency. So this is the outcome that we're trying to prevent, and we're looking at the predictors that lead to that outcome. That's why it's in green. Gang involvement, substance abuse, arrest that happens as a higher probability depending on the level of delinquency. In some cases, kids might get arrested on their first delinquent act, but often it's the case that kids are engaging in a pattern of delinquency that then triggers the probability of arrest. School dropout, an extremely potent fork in the road. Once kids are completely disconnected from school and they drop out, in many ways, it locks them into a trajectory that's very difficult to disentangle once they get out of being a juvenile. Once they're in adulthood, rectifying the consequences of not failing to graduate from school are extremely difficult. Even with GED interventions, those GED interventions don't yield the same long-term benefits as a high school diploma does. And so trying to change the trajectory in adulthood is more challenging than trying to change it in adolescence, especially when you have all these resources to get kids in school and you have legal mandates for kids to be in school, which are things that are assets, not liabilities at that age. One important thing to note about these predictors is that there's a process of entanglement that occurs once a young person is arrested. And the evidence shows that these effects are not only predictors, but in many cases, causal effects of having been arrested. You start with the things we just saw: behavior problems, special education, grade repetition, chronic absence, truancy, poor grades, and aptitude, test scores, deviant peer associations, gang involvement, all as important predictors of delinquency, along with substance abuse. And then suspensions are themselves a predictor of delinquency. School dropout as well. Now, delinquency, as we talked about before, raises the probability of arrest. It's a good likelihood that at some point in a series of delinquent acts, you will get arrested. But once you get arrested, once that scarlet letter and that labeling occurs, it triggers a feedback spiral, meaning it causes dropout to be more likely. It causes an increase in truancy. It causes greater involvement in gangs, etc. And it causes delinquency. So evidence using rigorous quasi-experimental methods show that when youth get that label, they are more likely to engage in the behaviors or have the outcomes that predict further delinquency and further being arrested and eventually incarcerated or confined. So this feedback spiral that happens around adolescence after a series of delinquent involvements is the thing that we are really trying to unwind. We're trying to prevent this spiral from sedimenting into a trajectory that leads to off-track outcomes for the duration of a person's life. The types of environmental predictors, I'm going to go through these fast because I'm taking a little bit too much time here. Some of the most salient predictors at an environmental level, and everything I'm going to list on this slide is drawn from not only, it's not only been a stable predictor across several longitudinal studies throughout most of the, or at least the latter half of the 20th century into today, but it's also stable predictors that have shown up in other countries. So these aren't predictors that are just drawing on a single data set or a single longitudinal study, either in California or nationally. These are the types of predictors that are consistently shown across countries and across time to predict delinquency and ultimately arrest. Having a large family is a potent predictor of juvenile involvement, and that's an early risk factor. Child maltreatment, being involved in the child welfare system, poor family functioning, parent criminality, sibling delinquency, inconsistent or harsh discipline, and low parental monitoring or supervision, particularly during adolescence. Some of the school predictors are the quality of teachers or the quality of the school that a young person's in, the climate of the school, whether the school engages in exclusionary discipline, whether the school has has school policing and the nature of that school policing. And then up at the place level, we have aggressive contact, police contact, aggressive policing. There's evidence that's emerged that suggests that interaction with aggressive policing, especially in the form of things like stop and frisk policing, are themselves criminogenic, meaning they cause youth who encounter that on a regular basis to be more likely to engage in delinquency. And the mechanisms that have been identified connected to that are what's called legal socialization, that young people develop a less respect for authorities as a result of unfair treatment in public spaces by legal authorities, legal figures. And this type of lack of respect for authority filters over to other types of authority, including teachers and school principals and other adults. And so there's a corrosive effect of this type of policing on youth's risk for delinquency, but also their relationship with adults in schools. Neighborhood disadvantage, witnessing violence or being victimized, all are predictors. And then down at the bottom here, we're looking at learning, emotional, behavioral disabilities, low self-control, ADHD, depression, PTSD. All of these are profiled in some depth in the report. So I summarized the literature that speaks to all these predictors, especially if that literature suggests that these factors are causal and not just predictive. So for anybody who likes getting a state-of-the-art summary on the literature, all of these are covered in the report. The interventions, once we've identified those pathways, of course, the question is, what do we do about it? What do we do about those risk factors that put a kid on track to being involved in the juvenile legal system? And there are a number of interventions that are profiled in the report. I'm going to give you a high level. Again, here I'm going to be listing a number of things. They are profiled in depth in the report. They're summarized. They're all based upon randomized controlled trial evaluations. And this is kind of the state-of-the-art for the intervention space. We're going to look at the life course outcome or developmental predictor that's targeted at the bottom. And then we're going to look at the interventions here as well at the top. And they're going to be placed where they are measured on this life course canvas of ages 6 to 11, 12 to 13, and 14 to 17. You'll often see interventions that are described on clearinghouses, whether that's the social welfare clearinghouse or the Wet Works clearinghouse or the crimesolutions.gov clearinghouse that will list an intervention as having an age span that's potentially eligible for treatment. It will say this intervention can be applied to kids from 12 to 18. Well, where I put these interventions on this timeline is where they were actually evaluated. So what was the average age of the population that was treated with the intervention that got the result? Oftentimes, interventions that work well with adolescents don't work well with kids younger than 12. And sometimes interventions that work well with early adolescents don't work as well with older adolescents. And so I don't want to create the impression based upon these clearinghouses that that entire age span is the active age span that should be targeted. I want to focus here on what was actually evaluated to give you a sense of what the evidence can support. We're going to look at interventions that target family environments, that target school environments, and that target community contexts. The first intervention in a community context is Big Brothers Big Sisters of America, and that affects behavior problems. That's the only intervention I could identify that specifically affected externalizing behavior, and it affected it for this age group, this kind of this tween group that's entering early adolescence. Special education identification or having learning disabilities, grade repetition, or deviant peer associations could not find any interventions that targeted those risk factors. When it came to chronic absence and truancy, check and connect, a early tween intervention, and then pathways to success, an actual early adolescence intervention, both were effective at reducing absences, days absent in school. And again, all of these are described in a fair amount of depth in the report, what the top populations they target, generally what the interventions entail, and then the effect sizes for the outcomes. For low verbal reading aptitude, the Reading Edge, Read 180, and Achieve 3000 all really targeting early adolescence into later adolescence or middle adolescence are listed here. Targeting suspensions, responding in peaceful, positive ways affects in-school suspensions, social belonging, self-affirmation intervention, student threat assessment, positive behavioral intervention in schools, restorative practices, and empathic discipline intervention, all interventions that effectively target either office disciplinary referrals or suspensions themselves. And as you see, they're all generally focused on this earlier adolescence period, not as many interventions we've established that focus on later adolescence. When it comes to poor grades and test scores, two interventions, particularly around the 9th and 10th grades, Saga Education, and then BAM and match tutoring. Match tutoring is the old name for Saga Education. Saga Education is a high dosage tutoring intervention that improves math grades and math test scores. BAM is Becoming a Man, which we're going to learn more about in just a moment, was combined with high dosage tutoring and got extraordinary effect sizes for young males in the South and West sides of Chicago. But both of these are targeting that age span there, and that's all I'll say for sake of time. Disciplinary referrals. My teaching partner secondary is an intervention that targets teachers, not students, and it showed significant decreases in the usage of office disciplinary referrals and suspensions for kids of color, and it narrowed discipline gaps. No interventions we found that effectively reduce gang involvement. For delinquency, Becoming a Man, Choose to Change, Boston Summer Youth Employment Program, and One Summer Plus, a summer youth employment program in Chicago. All of these reduce delinquency, particularly violent delinquency. For substance abuse, we have Familias Unidas, and then we have the adolescent community reinforcement approach. Both of those are interventions targeting different age spans, different age strata, but had effective reduction in substance abuse disorders. School dropout, Becoming a Man. It's got that little yellow outline because it affects both delinquency and reduced school dropout 2 years post-intervention. So this intervention hits on two separate fronts of risk. Arrest and processing. We didn't have an intervention specifically that reduced arrest for those with no prior arrests. And so that's the landscape of interventions for preventing involvement in the juvenile legal system. One deep dive that I want to do here, or a couple deep dives, are both drawn from studies that were done in Chicago. And these are interventions with kids who are not yet involved in juvenile legal system, although you'll see some of the samples of these studies had prior arrests. But these are interventions basically targeting high-risk kids to prevent them from being involved in the juvenile legal system. Choose to Change was evaluated in Chicago. About 2,000 kids in a randomized controlled trial. So this is a field trial. It's a substantially sized trial that gives us an indication that this could work elsewhere. It could be portable to other places, and it could be invested in at a systems level. Youth were ages 13 to 18 in Chicago, 57% male, but a significant share of females here were part of this sample. The sample was 95% Black, 95% eligible for free and reduced price lunch in school, 35% were previously incarcerated, 20% had missed some portion of enrollment in school in the prior year. So they had unstable school attachment issues. The program is a 6-month intervention. It involves wraparound and mentoring services, fairly intensive mentoring and support services. The advocates meet with youth at least 8 hours per week, provide 24/7 support, also meet with the youth's families. But a separate component, so you have that mentoring, wraparound support, relationship, intensive support for youth. But then you also have a group-based curriculum that focuses on group therapy. It's not conventional group therapy in the way you might do group therapy through your healthcare provider, but it's a curriculum that includes and is built on ideas in cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavioral therapy. So it's not strictly group therapy in the conventional sense, but it incorporates practices of group therapy, and the advocates attend the group therapy sessions with the youth that they are supporting and reinforces those therapeutic strategies in ongoing one-on-one support. There are also weekly group-based recreational activities, basketball games, movie nights, or shared meals. And the program adheres to a no reject, no eject policy. So once you're in, you're in. Kids aren't kicked out of the program because of attendance issues, because of maybe some behavioral issues. They're given more supports to address those. So it reinforces dosage requirements. The kids get the adequate dosage for the program to have effect. Some youth respond immediately. Some youth take time. And this intervention is designed to mitigate the attrition that happens when youth aren't seeing success early on. The impact of this intervention, it reduced arrests by 18% at 24 months. And 18 months, that was 18 months after the intervention concluded. So what's important about this is there's persistent effects when the youth aren't being treated any longer. They get that 6 months of intensive support of the curriculum. And then afterwards, 18 months later, a year and a half later, there was a 18% reduction in arrest risk for that population. When we look at another one, Becoming a Man, you'll see some of the similar strategies employed. here as well, particularly drawing on the principles of cognitive behavioral therapy or dialectical behavioral therapy and using a curriculum-based group strategy to support these young folks. This was a large randomized controlled trial, again, a field trial, 2,740 participants, 9th and 10th graders in Chicago, 100% male, largely Black, 69%, and Latino, 29%. 20% had IEPs, 36% were previously arrested. This was an intervention that lasted 1 to 2 years. It was a school-based pull-out program. So while Choose to Change, the one we just looked at, is a community-based program, targets youth directly in the community. Referrals might occur through schools, might occur through community-based organizations, churches, et cetera, might occur through the courts, or might occur through the juvenile legal system. In the case of Becoming a Man, this is a program that's embedded in schools, lasts 1 to 2 years of dosage. Kids are pulled out of a regular class in order to participate. Provides a great incentive for a lot of kids to participate in this model. There's weekly group sessions, typically consisting of 8 to 15 students. They receive individual counseling through trained staff mentors. They participate in a 30-lesson rites of passage curriculum grounded in cognitive behavioral therapy. So we see cognitive behavioral therapy again emerge here, focuses on thinking patterns, trying to disrupt how certain thoughts emerge, what those thoughts mean, how kids act on those thoughts, how those thoughts make them feel, kind of the tenets of cognitive behavioral therapy. And it has significant positive effects on outcomes for these youth. It reduced total arrests by 35%, violent crime arrests by 50% at 24 months. There was no post-intervention measurement period here, so we don't know how these effects persist after the treatment period ends. There's good possibility that there is persistence because 2 years after the treatment ends with this intervention, kids were 20% more likely to graduate high school. So there's very likely substantial persistence of effects. It just wasn't measured in this particular RCT. So both of these programs providing a lot of multifaceted support, but also grounded in the idea of addressing issues, thinking patterns, behavioral patterns through cognitive behavioral therapy or dialectical behavioral therapy. Now, we've also learned and report a lot in this intervention on policy stuff. I'm sorry, in this report on policy-related issues. And one of those policy-related issues is school discipline and how school discipline contributes to the school-to-prison pipeline, ultimately to disparate trajectories of juvenile legal involvement and ultimately adult criminal legal involvement. There have been, over the past decade or so, a slight decline in suspension rates, but large disparities remain. You'll see that there's a small decline, or about 15, 18% decline in suspension rates for Black kids, a smaller decline for Native American youth. Filipino youth is seeing a 1% decline, about 50%. But disparities have budged fairly little across these groups. So we're seeing some progress, but we're seeing disparities. The lifetime risk of suspension tells a more accurate story, though. These rates that you see here, 10.1, 8.6, get my pointer out, sorry. 10.1, 8.6, those are annual rates. What they understate is the lifetime risk of suspension. And when we look at the evidence on the effect of being suspended, it shows that being suspended one time can have long-term harmful effects. Kids who are often suspended one time are suspended multiple times. And so it's better to look at the lifetime risk of suspension for a kid rather than whether they are suspended in a particular year. And when we look at that data from the nation as a whole, we unfortunately don't have that data for California, we see just the scale of suspension rates. So 2/3 of Black boys will be suspended at some point in their K through 12 school career. Half of Latino boys, 40% of white boys, 45% of Black girls, 29% of Latino girls, and 20% of white girls. So a fairly high prevalence of suspension rates for young people across their school careers. And if any single suspension poses long-term risk, these numbers are fairly daunting. But importantly, most suspensions occur in middle school and early high school. So this is California data, and we're just looking at boys here who have significantly higher suspension rates, and we can see suspension rates really peak in grades 7 through 8. They're also high in the 9th grade, but this data pulls 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grades, so it's lower. But if we had that in there, it'd probably be up here or close just for the 9th grade relative to the 7th, 8th grade. So what we're really talking about is the high-risk zone for suspensions, the 7th, 8th, and 9th grades. You also have some risk in 4th to 6th grades, but it's really the shooting up here, which we should be targeting for intervention. Causes of disparities in the schools. There's been a lot of focus on student behavior, especially for the contribution to disparate patterns of exclusionary discipline, for the gaps in office disciplinary referrals or suspensions that we see for Black, Latino, or Native American kids. But the evidence is increasingly showing that a big part of the story as well is teachers. And it's not all teachers, it's specific types of teachers, it's specific types of situations that teachers encounter that is giving rise to elevated suspension rates and disparities. A large longitudinal national study that's talked about in the report shows that differential treatment within schools is probably the biggest contributor to the gap. So it's not just some schools are high suspension schools and other schools are low suspension schools, although that is the case. But that differential is not the primary explanation of why we have these racial gaps in school disciplinary outcomes. It's actually things that are happening within individual schools. Black youth, Latino youth are more likely to attend high punishment schools, which is a factor, but it's secondary to treatment within any particular school. There's a bias in top referring teachers. And so if you look at rates of referral to the office disciplinary referrals that then give rise to suspensions, what you find is that there are a relatively small number of teachers that do the lion's share of referral for discipline. And what this suggests is that we can target those teachers with supports and other things that can mitigate this risk within schools. There's also teacher inexperience. Teachers with less experience are much more likely to refer kids to the office than teachers with more experience. And as teachers get more experience, they're less likely over time to refer kids to the office. And so teacher inexperience is a factor that contributes to this story. There's also what are called vulnerable decision points. These are the interaction of multiple factors. It could be the teacher experience with, for example, in a particular grade, it's the 7th grade, after lunch, dealing with kids unable to settle down. Those all interact. And so when you look at data that's trying to identify these vulnerable decision points, they've identified a fairly number of repeated vulnerable situations that contribute to escalated disciplinary infractions. It's these types of teachers after lunch dealing with these types of behaviors that are contributing 30% of our office disciplinary referrals. If we just address those situations systematically, we can cut our office disciplinary referrals substantially. So these are the new insights that are coming out of a lot of empirical research on how do we get school discipline outcomes under control. And it's not just some of the things that we've engaged in, which are state policies, for example, around willful defiance. We've banned suspensions of willful defiance in K through 3 in 2013, and grades 4 through 5 in 2019, and then grades 6 to 8 for 5 years starting in 2019, and then to all grades until 2029 starting in 2023. We've enacted these policies, and they haven't had, unfortunately, the effect that we'd hoped at the scale we hoped. There have been 5 school districts in California that enacted K through 12 bans on willful defiance. And so these have been the first case studies that have given us the type of data to analyze to determine whether or not banning willful defiance for middle school students and high school students actually significantly brings down disparities, actually significantly brings down suspension rates. Los Angeles adopted a ban on willful defiance for secondary students a few years ago. San Francisco, Pasadena, Oakland, and Azusa all did the same. So researchers have analyzed these school districts using causal inference methodologies to identify whether or not the implementation of those bans in these school districts resulted in A, declines in suspensions overall, and B, decline in racial disparities in suspensions. And what they found is that willful defiance suspensions decline, but overall suspensions actually increased in some instances. So even though we got rid of willful defiance, we didn't reduce suspensions. For San Francisco, Oakland, Pasadena, and Azusa, willful defiance suspension rates declined by approximately 69%, with 78% reductions for white students, 73% reductions for Black students, 67% for Latino students. However, overall suspension rates for Black students increased by 22%, actually causing disparities to grow. What turned out happened is they substituted categories. No longer are we suspending for willful defiance, we're suspending for non-willful defiance, which whatever the hell that means, and miscellaneous categories. Essentially, we created new categories, still engaging in the same types of behaviors. The pattern was more pronounced in schools with a lower proportion of Black teachers. In Los Angeles, suspensions declined substantially for all groups, including Blacks, but a racial gap still persisted. Los Angeles is the only case study where we saw Black rates actually decline. And that's partly because Los Angeles implemented restorative practices along with the ban on willful defiance, and that's suspected to be the explanation for that result. What is required to properly address school discipline disparities is appropriately, as people have identified, a multi-tiered strategy. And multi-tiered strategies have been used in a variety of instances to improve socio-emotional skills for young people, to improve cognitive academic outcomes. It's also importantly an intervention to address school discipline outcomes and school discipline disparities. That's where you target all students with universal interventions, and they're listed here. And these, again, are profiled in depth in the report. You have your more targeted interventions for youth that are receiving office disciplinary referrals or who have at least one suspension, things like restorative practices, things like student threat assessments. And then you have your more intensive interventions, one-on-one instruction, counseling, wraparound supports for kids who are showing persistent patterns of disciplinary outcomes, which are likely indicative of something happening outside of school, more so than things happening inside of school. This is absolutely something that we should do. But we should also recognize, because we know teachers are involved in these risks of students being suspended based upon a variety of factors like teacher experience, like time of the day, like the circumstances that they're interacting with students around, we have a multi-tiered intervention strategy targeting teachers as well, where all teachers get a set of supports like restorative practices, like professional development and classroom management, cultural responsiveness, etc., school-wide positive behavioral intervention and supports. But that teachers who are actually showing elevated risk, meaning they're on average more likely to refer than their peers, new teachers in the grade 7 through 10, they get things like empathic response to behavior, a more targeted intervention. And for those teachers who are the highest referrers in a school or a district, they get My Teaching Partner Secondary, which is a fairly involved coaching professional development program that has been shown to improve academic outcomes as well as disciplinary outcomes and to close disciplinary gaps between Black students and other students. That is targeted to the teachers that are higher referrers. But basically, we have a multi-tiered response that addresses both students and educators, not just students, which is sort of the myopia of current practice frameworks. Okay, I'm a little behind on time, so I'm gonna get to the case study faster so you guys get a sense of what lifting the bar is all about. But the second half of the report focuses on building ladders, ensuring that kids that are involved in the juvenile legal system end up back in school, successfully thriving in school, all the way to high school completion. We know that there are a lot of ways to measure recidivism, and there's a lot of ways to measure the predictors of recidivism. We focus on, in this report, a metric I call reentry success. And that's no new arrest or adjudication, which is the common metric for success in the field of the juvenile legal involvement. And we focus on both arrest and adjudication because they measure two different things. And if you choose one over the other, you can introduce biases in predicting the outcomes for kids, meaning Black and Latino kids are differentially likely to recidivate depending on if you use one of these metrics or the other. And I talk about that in the report. So we should use both, especially to address disparate issues that might arise. But in addition to reducing recidivism, we want consistent connection to school and graduation. Not just that kids aren't involved in delinquent acts that involve the juvenile legal system, but that they're on a pathway to success, that their trajectory is shifting towards something that will pay dividends long term. Keeping a kid non-adjudicating, but then they eventually drop out of high school is a terrible result. That's not a victory. Having them not adjudicate, but also not rearrest or be adjudicated, but succeed in graduating from high school is a laudable result that we want to aim for. And the last thing is improve mental and behavioral health, because they could be succeeding in those outcomes, but still have substance abuse issues that really play out in adulthood when all the supports are no longer present, et cetera. So reentry success, meaning these three important pillars, is what the report argues for. The predictors of involvement in re-involvement, rearrest, and incarceration are whether kids in school, whether they're absent from school, whether they have a substance abuse issue, whether they have poor grades or significantly undercredited, whether they are formally processed or diverted to diversion at the entry to the juvenile legal system, whether they experience suspensions and expulsions while being involved in school, after being arrested or incarcerated, whether their special education status, whether they attend an alternative school. And an alternative school is interesting because the evidence shows it predicts two divergent outcomes. Attending an alternative school predicts a greater likelihood that kids will succeed academically and graduate, and it also predicts that they're more likely to recidivate. Both of those outcomes are associated with alternative school enrollment. And I've talked to a few folks in alternative school, and they're like, yeah, that makes sense. That tracks. And part of the argument is that because there's a peer effect of being around a lot of kids who are involved in the juvenile legal system, but because alternative schools are really adapted to the needs of this population, they do a better job at promoting their long-term educational success. Attachment to school while confined is another predictor of recidivism. Associating with delinquent peers itself is another predictor. An effective use of leisure time post-involvement. Now, studies have tried to identify what are the most important outcomes or predictors we should aim to achieve for this population to reduce recidivism. And there's increasing study of this question that if we look at all of these, really, what should we be focusing on the most? What should be the biggest priority here? Should we be addressing expulsions and expenses for this population? Should we address substance abuse issues primarily? Should we be trying to reduce their involvement in delinquent peers, which is what things like multisystemic therapy does, for example? Should we be addressing school-related outcomes? A set of researchers who've been studying juvenile justice interventions for a long time had a very innovative study in which they wanted to understand, in all the interventions that have successfully reduced recidivism, what other outcomes that they successfully changed at the same time? And might those other outcomes that they've changed be the reason that they successfully reduced recidivism? And so they conducted a study to probe this question. This is Wilson and Lipsey. It's profiled in the report. And they studied these other things, these other outcomes that are affected along with a reduction in delinquency. They call these potential change levers. These might be the intermediate or other outcomes that if we change those, that's the reason delinquency is shifting. They studied 153 intervention studies, 60% of which were randomized controlled trials. The other 40% were quasi-experimental studies. And what they found is that among all the non-delinquency outcomes examined, school-related factors showed the strongest relationship with school delinquency. And the specific ones they found were attending school, behavior leading to school discipline while enrolled in school, positive attitudes about school and teachers, and then persisting and staying in school were the strongest other factors that a randomized controlled trial intervention affected that was correlated with the reduction in delinquency. So what they emphasize is the idea that if we had to do a triage of all the outcomes we want to influence, it's a good bet that if we focused on the school-related outcomes, they would yield the biggest bang for the buck long-term in terms of reducing delinquency. And we get the collateral benefit that a kid attached to school has a chance at a future versus a kid who does not. The interventions that have targeted this population that we were able to identify include school enrollment, lifting the bar. We're going to do a quick deep dive into that intervention in a moment. We didn't identify school absence reduction interventions for kids who have been involved in the juvenile legal system. So everything on this slide, all these outcomes are kids who've already been arrested or have already been incarcerated, and we're looking at interventions that target that population to reduce these negative predictive outcomes. Substance abuse, multidimensional family therapy has been shown to reduce substance abuse. Poor grades, undercredited, did not find an intervention there for this population, nor did we find one for suspensions and expulsions. For rearrest and incarceration, the delinquency proper outcomes that we often look at, there was Adolescent Diversion Project, Crossover Practice Model, Multisystemic Therapy, Make It Right, Automaticity, CBT, all of these targeting kids in, you see this is ages 11 to 15, 16 to 17. So in the latter part of this first band and an early part of this second band, basically right in the square of mid-adolescence is where most of these interventions were evaluated. Formal processing or diversion, youth diversion has been established as having a pretty significant effect on reducing rearrest and incarceration. Special education identification, we didn't identify an intervention that altered that either identification process there. Not sure that would necessarily make sense. Aptitude, academic aptitude, Read 180, specifically for kids who were in detention, improved readings, test scores, grades, credits earned while confined, didn't identify a specific RCT evaluated intervention there. High school graduation, Avon Park, Youth Academy, and Street Smart improved high school graduation rates. So these are the interventions we're able to identify. A lot less effective a lot less in terms of the number of effective interventions targeting youth have been involved in the juvenile legal system that gets them on track. And that implies that preventing their involvement in the first place should be a huge priority. But for those that are involved, some of the most compelling evidence on what we can do for that population has come in the form of this lifting the bar intervention. We're looking at the same thing, population, the program, and the impact here. What this intervention showed, this was a small pilot intervention, but when you're dealing with kids re-entering school from detention, those numbers these days aren't huge. You don't have hundreds and hundreds of kids in a particular locality that fit that profile. So in this case, they tried to get the numbers higher, but this is literally all the kids that were reentering school during the period of the study, which was about, I think, 8 or 9 months. So this is the population that was included in this study that was randomized to treatment and control. The youth had an average age of 16. They were all in Oakland and had been released from a local detention facility. 87% were male, 82% were Black, and 21% were multiracial. This intervention stands out for its uniqueness in the sense that it is so brief. And secondly, it really is an intervention that goes through students to target teachers. The intervention is a 1-hour relationship-centered school reentry intervention designed to foster trust between the youth in the legal system and the educators that they encounter when they return to school. The intervention really aims to humanize students and promote meaningful adult-student connections for these youth returning from confinement. Students participate in a 45 to 60-minute one-on-one session with an adult staff person at the school several days after their release. The experience is described to the student as an opportunity for that student to help other students like them who are returning to school after being involved in the juvenile legal system. It's not presented as this is to help you, the student. It's for you, the student, to help other students. This leverages an youth development psychological principle that youth often want to have a sense of autonomy. And when adults are intervening with them to try and influence their behavior, they have natural psychological aversions to this. This is a need that young people have, particularly adolescents. So if you frame the exercise as one where they're helping others, which actually reinforces their sense of autonomy because they get to choose to help others, it also reinforces other aspects of a positive identity. Kids are more receptive and tend to embrace this. Crucially, it causes the effect, the message that you want to communicate to get through the defenses. And so, and framing exercises as things where a kid is being engaged to help other students like themselves often will get them to embody and embrace the things that you're aiming for. Even though the activity is completed by students, the intervention actually targets adults and it opens the adults' eyes to who the student is, who they can be, and the role that that adult can play in helping that student achieve their outcomes. The 1-hour student activity seeks to normalize reentry challenges, such as feeling academically behind or wearing a GPS tracker. It basically tells young people, here are stories from other kids like you who've come back to school and all the challenges they've encountered. And these challenges happen to every kid who's in a situation like you. In fact, many of the challenges you experience happen to kids all over the place, no matter whether they're involved in the juvenile legal system. And kids overcome these outcomes. They overcome these outcomes with these strategies. They eventually stop feeling this way. So what you're experiencing as a re-entering adolescent to school is both normal and temporary, and it's going to go away. Then they ask the young person to identify their values and goals and other challenges. This is the adult staff person in this 45 to 60-minute conversation is asking them to identify challenges, identify values and goals. That is then put into, jumping ahead. Then next in this 45 to 60 minutes, they ask the young person, identify a teacher or caring adult at their school who they want to get to know better, who might be helpful to them as they reintegrate into school. That content is put in a form letter. That values, goals, and challenges are put in a form letter, and it's hand-delivered to that teacher that the student identified. That's the intervention. An hour with the kid, create the form letter, give it to the teacher. The letter is hand-delivered. This reduced youth incarceration rates by 58% over the next semester, reduced school disciplinary citations by 91%. The next semester is when at least 50% to 60% of kids will reoffend and be rearrested and reincarcerated if it's an offense that leads to reincarceration. So this is the sweet spot of prevention, and you're getting extraordinary effect sizes in that time frame. They're going to continue to do follow-up studies with this population to see if these effect sizes persist. But right now, this intervention is being scaled in Chicago public schools and other places, and there will be much larger sample studies that tell us the effectiveness of an intervention like this. There are other things profiled in the report, like systems barriers to successful school reentry that we identified from our field interviews. We profile the youth diversion literature's effectiveness for reducing delinquency. We do a deep dive on Placer County's cross-agency collaboration approach. We do a deep dive on Santa Clara County's foster vision system, which provides incredible data sharing that allows effective support and targeting outcomes for system-involved youth. But I want to leave you with these takeaways and take questions because I know I'm way over time. Involvement in the juvenile legal system locks youth into a pathway away from opportunity and toward punishment. We saw that with the predictors. We can prevent this involvement by getting rid of the chutes and by providing adequate supports. We can also, for youth that become entangled, create the strongest ladders, particularly involvement in school, that will get them off of that trajectory before they reach adulthood and reinforce a pathway ultimately to prison, to put them on a pathway to high school completion and ultimately a post-secondary opportunity. Evidence-based interventions and promising systems reforms show us that we can do this. It's a matter of bringing these tools together, bringing them together in local levels and potentially state levels to achieve the results that we're hoping for. So let me stop there. I know I'm supposed to pass it to Michael Massa at this point, Dr. Massa, but there might be a bunch of burning questions, and let me take as many of those as I can before I pass it to colleagues to close out.
Absolutely. And I'm not going to go in order only because I'm going to start with a question about the last intervention that you just mentioned. Someone was asking about lifting the bar, whether it was a CBO or community organization doing that intervention.
The intervention in terms of the adult that was with the youth for 45 to 60 minutes, that was the research team doing that, building out the practices of that. What this will be is it could be a community-based organization that does that role, or it could be a school staff person that does that role. They are trading both in their work of scaling this intervention in different places. So it could be any type of actor that has that responsibility.
Thank you for that. I have a couple other that I think you can probably answer pretty quickly. Back at the beginning, when you were talking about predictors, there was a question about retention and how that's being defined for this study. And the person noted their experience with less students being held back now due to social stigma. So they were curious about how you define retention for this report.
Retention is being held back a grade. So basically, the next year, you're with a younger cohort of students and not moving along with the older cohort you were with. And I've really focused on after sixth grade as being the critical risk period.
Got it. Thank you for that. Okay, we're gonna keep on rolling until we run out of time. The next question was when you were talking about predictors and interventions, there was a question about whether the data indicates the success of the interventions with young folks who are already in custody.
For the interventions that I just looked at in the second part of the second part of the presentation, yes, those are for kids who are in custody. They may not be in custody at the time of treatment. They may have been in custody, and it's a community-based program, which happens in a number of instances. But many of them target kids while in custody, while in detention.
Okay, and then there was a wondering about, as you were talking about, specifically when you were talking about the California school discipline reforms, there was a question about whether there's any connection to continuation schools at the district level and community day schools, specifically related to staffing. I'm not sure if you have insights on that.
I don't, unfortunately. That's not disaggregated in the studies that I looked at, and I don't actually have the state data on that.
All right. There's a couple other questions, but and then there's also, I should note, some really thoughtful comments in the chat that we will save to be able to share with both Arnold and Mary. I think that you will like to engage with. But I think that's probably all the time we have for questions, and we can gather all of these and use some of our responses in our follow-up email if that works for you.
Yes. And here's my email. If anybody needs to reach out to me directly and you have a question, I'm happy to answer via email if you like as well.
All right. Thank you for that. And we will go ahead and hand off to Micaela to go ahead and share our closing announcements.
Hey everybody, I'm Mika. I'm part of the Youth Advisory Board. And we would appreciate our guest speakers, Mr. Arnold Chandler, for sharing his insight today. And we also want to thank everyone for being part of this. We appreciate everyone showing up to the webinar as well today. Now for a few closing announcements. As we end the webinar, we invite all of you to complete the survey to provide feedback on your experience on today's webinar, and the link will be available in the chat. We would also like to remind you that this webinar will be available on the OYCR website within a week, and you'll receive a link to the recording along with the slides in a follow-up email. You can save the date for the next webinar in the Youth Justice Action Series on Thursday, January 22nd at 1 p.m., where OYCR staff will give a pertinent legal update, including a review of the 2025 legislation and appellate cases shaping juvenile justice. And the link to register for that is also in the chat. And that concludes today's webinar. And thank you again all for joining us. And we hope to see you next month. Happy holidays and have a great rest of the afternoon.